Hello, today is December 6th, 2023. My name is Dorian Williams Jr. I'm interviewing Denise Cathey for the Voces Oral History Center at the University of Texas at Austin. Please know that this recorded interview will be placed in the Nettie Lee Benson Latin American Collection here at UT Austin. So if there's anything you don't wish to talk about or answer, I will definitely honor those wishes. And similarly, if there is something you want to talk about that I don't bring up, please, by all means, bring it up and we can talk about it. A few things I'll say, because we're not conducting this interview in person, I do need to record you consenting to a couple of questions, 5 to be exact. So after I ask them, if you could just please say, yes, I agree, or no, I do not agree after each one, that would be fantastic. For the context of the first few questions, Voces wishes to archive your interview along with any other photographs or documentation at the Benson Library at UT Austin. We will retain the copyright of that interview and any other material you donate. So that being said, do you give Voces consent to archive your interview and your materials at the Benson Library?
I do. I will say for photos, because I shot those working for a newspaper, it would not be able to be exclusive copyright.
Got
Though I believe I retain copyright of those.
Okay.
So there shouldn't be any fees or anything to using them. And I
Okay.
freely allow Voces to use my work.
Perfect. I think afterwards we'll kind of offline about what those photos were to make sure those aren't included, but perfect. The second question, do you grant Voces copyright over the interview and any materials that you provide?
I do.
Awesome. Lastly, do you agree to allow us to post this interview on the internet where it may be viewed by people around the world?
I do.
Perfect. So some additional context for these next few questions. We do have a pre-interview form that we've already filled out. We use that information to help in research. The entire form is kept in a secure server. Before we send it to the Benson, we would have stripped out any contact information about yourself or your family members, so that won't be a part of your public file. And the public file itself will be only accessible at the Benson Library. So that being said, do you wish for us to share the rest of your interview in your public file and make it available to researchers at the center?
Yeah, I don't mind whatsoever.
Perfect. And our last question, on occasion, Voces receives requests from journalists who wish to contact our interview subjects. We only deal with legitimate news outlets. Do you give us consent to share your phone number, email with those journalists?
I do.
Perfect. So with that being out of the way, I'd love to kind of dig into this. So I always like to start just with the here and now. So could you tell us sort of work-wise, life-wise, where you are currently and what you're up to these days?
Yeah, well, first off, I'm 31 years old, and right now I am in Houston, Texas. I am working for Argus Media as a carbon markets price reporter and policy development reporter. So I cover basically California, Washington, Oregon, and Quebec's cap and trade markets, which are greenhouse gas emission caps and the allowances that let you emit, like, the equivalent is like 1 ton per allowance. So I'm doing that now. I started doing that in July of this year.
Wow, that's incredible. I'm curious, did you have any sort of prior knowledge in that field of sort of the climate centric field, or was that something that you sort of have been learning on the fly in the job? Because I know in journalism, and photography, it can kind of be all over the place.
Learning on the fly in the job. I did not know carbon markets were a thing before I interviewed for and got the job. So it's been a learning experience, but I've always worked a bunch of different aspects in every journalism job I've had. So
Mm.
kind of learning how to do, how do you write about policy, or how do you write about this event, or things like that. Like, you can kind of all pull it together. It's just like catching up with the technical knowledge that is the real thing you have to do.
Makes total sense, and it sounds like you get to travel a lot for this gig.
Eventually, yes, for conferences and things like that. But for the most part, for right now, I cover from Houston.
Awesome.
This year.
Cool. So it's a sore subject that I'm sure everyone is tired of talking about, but it's such a, I think, just pivotal moment in American and global history, for that matter. The pandemic and COVID. So I do want to kind of go back in time, and let's go to March 2020, if you will. I think the first sort of news of this virus is circulating on our social feeds and on TV. Do you remember sort of where you were around this time when this really came to the forefront of public attention, work-wise, life-wise, location-wise? Can you set the scene for us?
Yeah, so I remember exactly where I was when they declared the federal state of emergency in March, that it was a thing. There's actually a photo in the photos I provided of I was at the Dancy building in Cameron County in Brownsville, Texas. It used to be the old federal courthouse, but it got transferred to being the county courthouse. And we were all assembled in this like it was very almost like late 1800s, early 1910 style wooden courtroom. And behind the county judge, Eddie Trevino Jr., was a projector screen where we were waiting for the federal briefing to start. And we were all there. Reporters from Matamoros, reporters from Brownsville, reporters from all over the Rio Grande Valley. And basically we were going to hear the federal, and then the judge was going to come up to declare that this was officially a pandemic. And I remember it was like the quietest it's ever been in that room. It was very quiet, it was very tense. Um, and I just remember feeling like that was a very pivotal moment. Like it was a very just a very strange time. And it was, I think, the last time I would be in that room without wearing a mask. Um, so so yeah.
Wow. So I think it's safe to say that's probably the moment that you realized the seriousness of it. Because I think looking sort of back at how we covered that, because I think there was an absence of concrete information for a long time. Some people treated it more seriously than it was. Some people weren't as sure. Is this like, how long are we going to be working from home? Like, how long am I going to be at home? Is this an emergency? So is that courthouse moment for you sort of the moment you realized like this is for real, or was it before that?
I mean, I knew it was serious because I've kept a pretty tight network of cohort through NPPA and other people. So people who had gotten hit with it before us and who had been, before it was officially declared, had been working in hospitals and things like that. Like I knew it was serious. I mean, the valley is very different because yes, you have the border right there, but we're 5 hours drive from Houston, from Brownsville. It's there's it was sort of like we knew it wasn't here yet, but it was like, you're watching the tsunami come and it will come. It's just not quite there yet. And so it's kind of more, it made it official and it made it more, not necessarily scarier, but more just that this was going to be the state of things.
No, absolutely. Having lived in the Midwest, I think that's a great analogy, the tsunami part, because we used to see, you could see a tornado sort of brewing from a really long ways away, and it was really easy for everyone to sort of tell, like, this is going to be a tornado. But when you hear the sirens, I think it kind of really sets in, and you're like, this is here, and it's now our problem. So I like that analogy there. You kind of mentioned that would be the last time you were in the courtroom without wearing a mask, which is a great segue into just your general work experience during the pandemic and how that sort of
Yeah.
changed what work looked like for you. So just in terms of uh, outside of the obvious day to day of wearing the mask and the social distancing, I think in terms of your job responsibilities and how you went about your job, like how did the pandemic change that workflow for you?
Yeah. Well, first off, so the valley is it's both big and small. It's big in distance, but it's small in sort of the things that are available to you. So I did not have. I literally can tell you the first day I ever had a real mask, like a real official mask. But before then, they were already sold out. They were already gone. It takes a couple because we're on trucking routes, and so it takes a while for stuff to get to you once things become in demand. And so what we had were gone, and you couldn't really get N95s or anything like that at that point in time because they just hadn't made it to where for people who weren't buying in bulk. And I know this because I was looking up all of this. And so you couldn't get them. And so I literally remember how I got my first mask, which is we had done a story on a retired principal in Brownsville who was helping to sew masks. She's famous in Brownsville because like she's a principal and all of her daughters became principals. And I think her last name is Ayala. And basically we had been doing a story about that. And I was like, hey, I'm trying to source gear for me and my co-photographer. Do you have any extra? Like we have not been able to get masks. Do you have any? And she gave me some, which was great because they were fabric masks. So like we didn't know at that time that that was like I could have just worn nothing. But and they were printed with one was like a American like stars and stripes pattern, and the other one was a watermelon, but it looked like the Mexican flag. And I remember that it looked like the Mexican flag because the first time I wore it to a COVID briefing in the courthouse, the judge looked at me like I was insane. Like there was a moment where he looked up, looked right at me, and it was just, and just like shook his head. It was just like, oh, okay, we're going on with the briefing. Um, and then the first actual real mask I ever got was when I went to UTRGV has a it would be a couple months in. They have a center at the Edinburgh campus where they were actually doing COVID tests. They were actually testing. So in order to go in, they gave me an N95, and I still have it hanging from the dash of my car. I don't know why I still have it, but that was the first actual mask I was ever able to get. And so really outside of like, it was really hard to get supplies. My mom actually sent me giant amounts of like hand sanitizer and alcohol wipes because literally every night I would go over all of my camera gear with like rubbing alcohol because I had seen that I want to say like a Dallas Morning News or New York Times photographer like had posted some article about their routine for some kind of maybe like lens blog or something. And so I had started doing that because at that time I was also working on a story about the school suddenly having to pivot to remote education in a section of the country that doesn't have Wi-Fi capabilities, doesn't have a lot of infrastructure, might only have one parent in the home. Not everybody might have a laptop, and the schools weren't prepared. And so my guarantee during this time to these families was, hey, like when I come to you for these assignments, my gear will be clean. I won't have been anywhere else that day. I even bought my first pair of Rothy's because they were washable. So we didn't know if you cast your mind back, we didn't know how it spread at that time. They were still doing the surface theory, the airborne theory. Like we didn't know how long it lived on surfaces. So I bought those because they could be washable. And so like that happened. I in April I got asked to start working remotely at that point in time because we have I worked primarily out of the Brownsville Herald, and we have a very small office in the Venture X co-working space. And so I'm one of the youngest team members, or was one of the youngest at that time. And so because we were so close and we have a bunch of reporters like in their 60s, 70s, 80s, I needed to work remotely just because there were too many people too close. And our office is closed to the public. To my knowledge, have still not reopened to the public due to COVID.
Really?
Yeah, or at least when I finished and left in July, they still were closed to the public
That's incredible.
under work policy.
I feel like the lingering effects in a case like what you just mentioned are widespread. I feel like we read and see this all the time where things still haven't really fully recovered. So that's a great anecdote.
Yeah,
There's two things you brought up that I want to circle back to. I think the first, just for the sake of flow. So you mentioned like surface theory and not knowing how the
yeah,
virus spread. I'm curious how you navigated misinformation during that time because there was so many different ideas
yeah.
and opinions floating around. Like how did you navigate that within your job and making sure that you know the best and most accurate information available that can allow you to do your job and sort of not get conflicted with the information that was out there?
Yeah, I mean, basically, part of that was just usual, like the same you do when you're judging a source or when someone's reporting something and you want to corroborate it. It's like, okay, are these people all saying the same thing in the exact same way? in which case I maybe might not trust that, because that sounds a lot like there's one source they're all getting it from, and kind of just looking and going, okay, for other things, what is working? Like for, if this is something that's like the flu, okay, well then it sounds like a mask is going to work because flus are airborne. So at the very least, like that's going to work. It sounds like basic cleanliness, hand sanitizer on my hands is going to at least do a little bit of something. Um, like it just like in anything that seemed too outside of everything, I kind of just pushed to the side. Like I never thought too hard about the ivermectin part of things because it just seemed so weird and so fringe that, I wasn't never willing to touch that. And part of it was just evaluating, is this something that is coming out and that people are doing mostly because of fear? Or is this something where it sounds like there's something else behind it and I can corroborate this? Because I was also in discussion with, county health authorities, state health authorities, local doctors. We were talking to local doctors, must have been like every week. Um, and so it was something where there was a lot of medical information happening, and a lot of it was, I mean, from an area that knows how to do pandemics, had already done the Zika pandemic, had already responded basically to some big things. And so there wasn't a fully fledged system, but there was kind of something there where they knew how to disseminate some information.
Wow, got it. So I'm curious, was that mentality sort of uniform across the board for your coworkers in your unit and the people you were on site with as well? Or was it sort of a free for all? Like, how did they manage that within your work unit?
I mean, that's hard to say because like by April I was working remotely. I didn't ever come back to work in the office again.
Mm,
And so we had some Slack connection, but my older coworkers weren't on Slack. So for, for a couple years there, I would basically talk to them, but like if we were on an assignment or something. So that's really hard for me to say. Like I know I was in touch with my former editor Laura Martinez somewhat, but for the most part, we were getting our information from the same press conferences we would be at. So there wasn't really a lot of discussion.
got it. No, that makes perfect sense. I think the other thing I wanted to circle back to, so I think you mentioned it was Miss Ayala that was making the fabric masks, and then the school that I think went to Zoom that you mentioned that maybe didn't have the capabilities to necessarily do that. Like, what were just some of the stories, memorable or difficult, that still sort of stick with you from reporting and taking photos during that time, at least prior to working from home?
Okay, so you said Miss Ayala and then you froze. So I don't know what the question is.
Oh, I'm so sorry. So I think you mentioned Miss Ayala, and then you'd also mentioned the school that you worked with that transitioned to learning on Zoom that maybe had some difficulties doing that. I'm just curious what kind of stories, whether they're difficult or memorable, like that, kind of stuck with you from that time.
Yeah, well, just to clarify, it wasn't a school. I had located about 4 or 5 different families in different schools and different age levels. But one of the things that really stayed with me was just like I mean, foremost in my mind was I remember the day we first got um oh, the vaccine, the one that starts with an M. Sorry, I got COVID myself while I was working down there, and so my recall is a little bit suspect sometimes. What is the vaccine called? Starts with an M.
I've had it 3 times, and I've gotten the vaccine, but it's called Moderna.
Moderna. Yes, I remember the day that Moderna came to the valley because it was a thing. Literally, it came in a fridge strapped into a sheriff's vehicle. The lights were going, and they had like armed guards for it. It came into, I think it's Valley Regional Hospital. You've frozen again, so hopefully you're still getting what I'm saying.
I am.
I'm
I'm
gonna
so sorry.
pause until you unfreeze.